Welcome to All in All.
Hello.
Today, we're really diving deep into a story that, well, feels like a cornerstone for so many of us. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit.
Absolutely. It's one of those books, isn't it? It just sort of sticks with you. A childhood favorite for so many, but then you go back as an adult and wow, there's just so much more there.
Yeah, exactly. Layers upon layers. History, myth, some surprisingly complex ideas, all packed into what seems like, a simple adventure story at first glance.
Right, hidden depths.
That's precisely what we're aiming to explore today. We've pulled together quite a range of sources for this deep dive articles with different takes, academic work looking at its origins and legacy, plus our own notes from, well, just spending time with the text again. And the goal, really, is to trace it all. Where did it come from? Why is it still so important? How has it changed over time? What kind of impact did it have? Which was huge, obviously. And maybe most importantly, what can we still take away from it today?
And it all kicks off with Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, perfectly happy in his cozy hole in the Shire, living a quiet, very predictable life.
Until Gandalf shows up.
Until Gandalf and 13 dwarves show up on his doorstep and, well, pull him into a completely unexpected journey. Reluctantly at first.
Yeah.
Very reluctantly.
Okay, so let's start right there at the beginning. The origins. Where did The Hobbit actually come from?
Well, the publication date is 1937. And I think the key thing to remember right off the bat is how it was initially positioned. It was conceived and definitely marketed as a children's book.
Right, which is interesting because you get some diehard Tolkien fans who sort of resist that label now, don't you? They emphasize the depth, the connections to the wider mythology.
They do, and they're not wrong about the depth. It absolutely offers plenty for adults. But historically speaking, the original target audience really was children. That was the intent.
And maybe that initial focus helps explain its scale compared to, say, The Lord of the Rings. Some of the sources we looked at suggested that because this was Tolkien's first published novel, maybe he wasn't quite ready to, unleash the full weight of Middle-earth yet.
That's a plausible idea. Maybe he felt more comfortable starting with something a bit more contained, less sprawling than the histories he was already developing, kind of dipping his toe in the water. Novel-wise.
Testing the waters.
Yeah. But, and this is crucial, the sources also make it very clear that the larger world, his whole legendarium, was definitely buzzing around in his head even as he wrote The Hobbit. Those deeper world politics, as one source calls them, they were there.
They just sort of peek through occasionally.
Exactly. They surface in these slightly diminished ways, like hints about the ancient history of the elves or mentions of things like the fall of Gondolin, big epic events from his mythology, but presented here in more of a, well, a fairy story mode, as the source put it, faded echoes almost.
Right, not the main focus, but enough to give you that sense of a much, much older world lying just beneath the surface of Bilbo's adventure.
Precisely. And sometimes those bigger politics directly impact the plot. The most obvious example is probably Gandalf leaving the group.
Before Mirkwood, yeah. That always felt significant.
It is. It's not just a convenient way to make Bilbo step up. Gandalf is called away on high business, serious stuff related to the growing threat of the necromancer down in Dol Guldur in southern Mirkwood.
So Bilbo's little quest gets directly tangled up with the bigger fight against evil happening elsewhere.
Absolutely. It forces Bilbo and the dwarves to manage without their wizard, pushing Bilbo into a more central, active role. And it's fascinating, actually. The sources point out that early readers really picked up on that.
They guessed the necromancer was important.
Yeah, they sensed that this wasn't just a throwaway line. Gandalf's seriousness about it made people think, okay, this necromancer guy, he's probably going to be a big deal later on.
Which, of course, he was.
Well,
turned out to be Sauron himself, setting the stage for Lord of the Rings.
exactly. A key piece of foreshadowing. And speaking of connections and changes, another really fascinating part of the origin story is how the text itself evolved. Specifically, that famous change to the chapter Riddles in the Dark.
Ah, yes, the Gollum encounter. It wasn't always the way we read it now, was it?
Not at all. In the first edition, from 1937, the whole interaction is, well, quite different. Gollum is much less menacing, less corrupted by the ring. He actually agrees to the riddle game quite willingly.
And he was going to get Bilbo the ring if he won.
Pretty much. He offers it as a present if Bilbo wins and he can't guess the last riddle, assuming he can find the ring again. It's treated more like a game, a wager. Gollum is creepy, sure, but not the utterly consumed creature he becomes later.
But then Tolkien starts writing The Lord of the Rings, and the ring becomes everything. The one ring to rule them all.
Precisely. It becomes this object of immense corrupting power. And Gollum's character becomes entirely defined by his desperate addiction to it. So that original, slightly more lighthearted version in The Hobbit just didn't fit anymore. It contradicted the darker reality of the ring's nature.
So he rewrote it for the second edition in 1951.
He did. He revised the chapter quite dramatically. Now Gollum is desperate, suspicious, already sensing Bilbo might have his precious. The riddle game becomes a way for Gollum to stall, or maybe to justify attacking Bilbo. The ring's influence feels much stronger, much more sinister, right from the moment Bilbo finds it.
And Tolkien had that clever in-universe explanation for the change too, didn't he?
Yes, which is just brilliant. The idea put forward is that the first edition represents the story Bilbo originally told. Maybe he fudged the details a bit, made himself look better, claiming he won the ring fairly in a game, perhaps even lying to himself about how he got it.
Making it sound less like theft or trickery.
Exactly. And then the revised version, the one we all know now, is presented as the true account, maybe pieced together later by Gandalf or others, revealing the ring's darker influence in Gollum's true state. It makes Bilbo a potentially unreliable narrator for that part of his own story.
Which adds another layer entirely. Wow. And it wasn't just the words that were part of the origin, right?
Oh,
Tolkien
yeah.
drew pictures too.
He did. He was quite an accomplished amateur artist. He illustrated the first edition himself, maps, drawings of scenes like the trolls or Smaug's lair.
Those black and white illustrations and the maps feel so integral to the book's feel.
They really do. And the sources mention that different editions actually have different numbers of his illustrations. You know, a deluxe version might have 17 illustrations and maps in the text, maybe another 11 in the foreword. His art really helped establish the visual identity of Middle-earth for the first time.
And just quickly going back to influences, you mentioned his larger world, but the sources also brought up his academic side. Obviously, his knowledge of myths and languages was huge, but there was a mention of Thomas More's Utopia. That seems unexpected.
It does seem a bit left field, doesn't it? A fantasy adventure versus a philosophical work about an ideal society. But the connection hinges on a pen name Tolkien used early on. Oxymore.
Oxford and More.
Exactly, a blend of Oxford, where he worked, and Thomas More. It suggests More's ideas were on his mind. And the link to Middle-earth, according to this interpretation, is through Numenor.
The great island kingdom from the backstory, the one that gets sunk.
Right, which in its early days is described as this near-perfect, almost utopian society, a gift to men from the Valar. So the idea is that Tolkien's concept of this idealized island kingdom might have drawn, in part, from the tradition of utopian literature like More's, even though Numenor, like most utopias in literature, eventually falls. It just shows the breadth of his influences beyond the obvious Norse myths and sagas.
Okay, so a really rich origin story there, evolving text, deep influences. Let's shift now to significance. Why does The Hobbit still matter so much? Why do we keep talking about it?
Well, on the most fundamental level, it just endures as a fantastic story. One source calls it a literary treasure of childhood, and that feels right. For countless readers, it's their first real entry point into imaginative literature, into fantasy.
A gateway book.
Definitely, but its significance runs much deeper than just being a kid's classic. As we touched on, even though it started that way, it packs in so much meaning that resonates just as strongly, maybe even more strongly, with adults.
And Tolkien himself really argued for that, didn't he?
Yeah.
In his essay on fairy stories.
He did, very forcefully. He pushed back hard against the idea that fantasy or fairy tales are somehow juvenile or escapist in a negative way. He argued they deal with fundamental human desires and truths, things like recovery, escape, consolation. Not escape from life necessarily, but escape to a deeper reality, you could say. He saw real value in them for everyone.
And The Hobbit, historically, played a big role in sort of legitimizing fantasy for adult readers.
Hugely important role there. Before The Hobbit's success, fantasy was often sidelined. It seemed strictly as kids' stuff. Its popularity, which kind of took publishers by surprise, showed there was a real appetite for this kind of imaginative world-building among adult readers, too. It helped make it okay for grown-ups to read about elves and dragons.
A bit like what happened decades later with Harry Potter, maybe. Starting for kids, but crossing over massively.
Very similar phenomenon, yeah. Breaking down those perceived barriers between age categories.
Now, one really interesting angle from the sources was looking at The Hobbit as an allegory about leadership. That's not the first thing most people think of.
No, probably not. You think hobbits, dwarves, dragon. But when you look closely at the characters and their journeys, it absolutely holds up as having insights into leadership, even relevant today.
Oh, so?
Well, look at Thorin Oakenshield. He's the designated leader, right? He's driven, charismatic in his way, focused on reclaiming his birthright. That focus inspires the dwarves.
But it also makes him incredibly proud, stubborn, and ultimately his greed for the treasure, especially the Arkenstone, corrupts his judgment.
Exactly. His leadership style becomes rigid, unwilling to compromise, even when peace and lives are at stake. It's a classic cautionary tale about how single-minded focus and unchecked desire for power or wealth can undermine a leader.
And you contrast that with Bilbo.
Right. Bilbo starts out as the complete opposite of a leader figure. He's small, timid, wants nothing to do with the quest, but his journey forces him to develop different kinds of strengths.
His cleverness, his stealth.
His surprising courage that comes out when his friends are in danger. He becomes a mediator. He uses diplomacy, even talking to Smaug. And crucially, he shows moral courage, like when he defies Thorin to give the Arkenstone to guard for the sake of peace. So the leadership lesson there is that effective leadership isn't just about authority or strength. It's also about adaptability, empathy, moral clarity, finding clever solutions. And that leadership can emerge from unexpected places. Bilbo's soft skills are just as vital to the quest's success, arguably more so at key moments than Thorin's hard leadership. Diverse skills make the team stronger. It's a very modern-sounding idea, really.
That leadership angle is fascinating. And to really unpack Bilbo's journey, that transformation, the sources kept bringing up Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey.
Yes, Campbell's monomyth framework from The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's almost like The Hobbit is a perfect textbook example of it.
Campbell argued that so many stories, myths, even dreams follow this underlying pattern, right? Departure, initiation, return.
That's the core cycle. Leaving the ordinary world, facing trials and transformations in an extraordinary world, and then returning, changed, to integrate that experience. And Bilbo's story maps onto that structure beautifully.
Okay, let's trace that. So departure, that starts with Gandalf turning up.
Absolutely. That's the call to adventure. Gandalf arrives, disrupts Bilbo's comfortable, prosy Hobbit routine. Bilbo, of course, initially resists. Adventure not for him. Messy, uncomfortable, dangerous things.
But Gandalf sees something else in him, that Tookish side.
Right. He sees a spark of the adventurous spirit inherited from his mother's side of the family. So even though Bilbo resists, the call has been made and it plants a seed. He eventually, somewhat bewilderedly, agrees to go.
And then he crosses the threshold, leaves the Shire behind.
He does. Leaving the familiar safety of his hobbit hole and the Shire marks his entry into the special world of the adventure. And that brings him straight into the initiation phase.
Which is mostly the road of trials, facing challenge after challenge.
Exactly. And The Hobbit lays these out almost episodically. First up, the trolls.
Which doesn't go too well for Bilbo initially.
Not at all. He gets caught trying to pick William the Troll's pocket. It highlights his initial inexperience. The dwarves get bundled into sacks. Gandalf has to intervene to save them by tricking the trolls until sunrise.
Bilbo does contribute a little, though, distracting them.
He does, yeah. He starts to show a little bit of quick thinking under pressure, even if it's clumsy. It's his first small step.
Then things get much more serious under the Misty Mountains with the goblins.
Much more serious. A terrifying capture, a desperate escape led by Gandalf again. But they gain key items here. The magical swords, Orcrist and Glamdring, later known as Biter and Beater.
And no sooner are they out of the goblin tunnels.
Then they're out of the frying pan into the fire, right into a clearing full of wargs, the evil wolves who are allied with the goblins. Things look dire again.
Until the eagles show up. A classic rescue from without in Campbell's terms.
Absolutely. The eagles are these majestic, ancient powers of nature who intervene at critical moments. They detest goblins and wargs, and they physically lift the company out of immediate danger, acting as powerful, unexpected allies.
Okay, safe from the wargs, their next encounter is with Bjorn.
The skin changer, yeah. Another unique challenge. He's suspicious of strangers, incredibly strong, and potentially dangerous. Gandalf has to use diplomacy and storytelling, introducing the dwarves 2 by 2 to win Bjorn's trust.
He's fierce, but ultimately helps them.
He is. The sources mention the gruesome details, like the goblin head and warg skin outside his house, showing his wild nature. But once Gandalf wins him over, Bjorn provides vital help. Ponies, food, and crucial warnings about Mirkwood Forest.
And Mirkwood. That feels like Bilbo's biggest test yet, especially without Gandalf.
It really is. Mirkwood is dark, confusing, enchanted. They lose the path, run out of food, get tormented by illusions of elvish feasts they can't reach.
Leading to the dwarves getting captured by the wood elves.
Right, led by their king, Thranduil, Legolas's father, though he's not named in The Hobbit. But before that, Bilbo has his defining moment against the giant spiders.
This is where he really finds his courage, isn't it?
Totally. He gets separated from the others and he has to fight them off alone. He uses his little sword, which he names Sting, a really important moment of claiming his own identity as something more than just a hobbit. He uses the ring's invisibility, yes, but also his own wits and bravery to rescue the dwarves who are all tied up in webs. He becomes the hero in that situation.
So he rescues them from the spiders, only for them all, except Bilbo, to be captured by the wood elves shortly after.
Exactly. Thorin is stubborn, refuses to tell the Elven King why they're there, so they're all locked up.
And again, it's Bilbo to the rescue, using the ring.
His big moment of ingenuity, he's invisible, scouts around, figures out the elves ship goods down the river in barrels. He hatches the plan, packs the dwarves into empty barrels, and sends them floating down towards Lake Town. It's risky, uncomfortable, but it works.
Which brings them to Esgaroth, Lake Town.
Where, surprisingly, they get a very warm welcome. The men of the lake remember the old songs and prophecies about the king under the mountain returning. They see the dwarves as a sign of hope, maybe a chance for prosperity to return. It's a bit different from the master of Lake Town, who's more focused on trade and politics.
From there, it's the final leg to the Lonely Mountain itself.
Yeah, and the mood shifts again. The land around the mountain is desolate, ruined by smog. The sources describe this part of the journey as weary, quiet, and stealthy. A lot of the initial excitement is gone, replaced by apprehension.
But they find the secret door.
They do, hidden high up, just as the old map described. It takes finding the keyhole at the right time on Durin's Day. But they get in.
And who goes first?
Bilbo, of course, the designated burglar. He has to creep down the long, straight passage the dwarves built, heading towards the dragon's lair.
Which leads to that incredible scene with Smaug.
One of the absolute highlights, Bilbo, summoning all his courage, sneaks in and steals just one cup. Smaug wakes up, furious, instantly knows something is missing.
And then Bilbo goes back in.
He does, wearing the ring this time. And he has that amazing conversation with Smaug, speaking in riddles, clue finder, web cutter, barrel writer. It's a battle of wits.
And crucially, he spots the weak spot.
Yes, that bare patch on Smaug's left breast. He also, perhaps unwisely, reveals enough that Smaug guesses the lakemen helped them. Smaug gets enraged, flies off to attack Lake Town, and Bilbo barely escapes being roasted. That's when he tells himself, never laugh at live dragons, a hard-earned lesson.
So, those are the trials. What about Campbell's atonement with the father? How does that fit Bilbo? It often means confronting some ultimate power or destiny.
It's a complex stage. One interpretation from the sources maps this onto Bilbo's actions with the Arkenstone. Thorin, who's become the sort of father figure or leader of the quest, is completely lost to dragon sickness at this point, obsessed with the treasure, especially the Arkenstone. He refuses to share or negotiate.
And Bilbo takes the Arkenstone.
He does. He sees the potential for a disastrous war between dwarves, men, and elves, so he makes a radical choice. He secretly takes the Arkenstone to Bard and the Elven King, using it as a bargaining chip to force Thorin towards peace. In a way, he's confronting Thorin's corrupted authority, his dragon sickness, and choosing a higher moral path, peace over possessiveness. He's asserting his own moral judgment against the flawed leader.
That's a powerful reading of it. A real moment of moral reckoning for him. And the boon, the prize.
Well, the immediate boon is the treasure itself, the goal of the quest Erebor reclaimed. Though, as we know, getting the treasure immediately leads to more problems about how to divide it.
Which sets up the final part of the cycle, the return.
Right. And the return journey isn't smooth either. It starts with the climax of the Battle of Five Armies. Just as the dwarves, men, and elves are about to fight each other over the gold, a massive army of goblins and wargs attacks them all.
So they have to unite against a common enemy. And they get help again. Another rescue from without.
Yes, crucially. The eagles return, attacking the goblins on the mountainsides. And then Beorn arrives in his terrifying bear form and just wreaks havoc on the goblin lines, turning the tide decisively when things looked very bad for the allies.
Bilbo misses a lot of the action, though, doesn't he? Gets knocked out.
He does. He puts on the ring, but gets hit by a falling stone early on. It reinforces that while he was key to the quest getting there, he's not a warrior in that large-scale sense. He learns about the victory and the costs afterward.
Including Thorin's death.
Yes, and their reconciliation scene just before Thorin dies is incredibly poignant. Thorin acknowledges Bilbo's worth and regrets his own anger.
After the battle, Bilbo finally heads home, crossing the return threshold.
Exactly. He travels back with Gandalf and later Beorn for part of the way. It's a time for reflection. The sources highlight how his recitation of the song The Road Goes Ever On, near the borders of the Shire, signals his transformation. He's acknowledging the journey's end, but also its lasting impact on him as he re-enters the familiar world.
And that leads to the final stage. Master of the two worlds and freedom to live.
This is about integrating the adventure back into his ordinary life. He's not just the same hobbit who left. He's seen the wide world, faced danger, found courage. He can now live comfortably in the Shire and retain the wisdom and perspective gained from his journey.
The other hobbits think he's a bit odd now, but he doesn't really care.
Not really. He's gained psychological freedom. The dwarves certainly see him differently. Gandalf tells them about Bilbo dodging guards and jumping over Gollum, and they have new respect for him. Gandalf himself confirms Bilbo has more about him than anyone guessed. He's achieved a kind of wholeness, bridging his hobbit nature with his adventurous experiences. He's free to be himself, a slightly eccentric hobbit with amazing stories and a broader view of the world.
That Campbell framework really illuminates Bilbo's arc. Beyond that, the sources also connect the Hobbit, maybe more subtly, to those big themes Tolkien explored later. Fall, mortality, and the machine. How do they show up here?
Well, even though The Hobbit is generally lighter in tone, you can definitely see echoes. The fall is there in the backstory of the dwarves. Erebor didn't just fall to Smaug. It fell arguably because the dwarves' own excessive greed and hoarding attracted Smaug in the first place. Smaug himself, consumed by greed, is a sort of fallen, corrupted creature.
And mortality.
It's constantly present. The threat of death hangs over the company throughout their journey: trolls, goblins, spiders, the dragon, the battle. Thorin's death at the end makes it very real. It underscores the fragility of life in this dangerous world.
Okay, and the machine. Tolkien used that term to talk about magic or power used for domination, right? Not just technology.
Exactly. It's about imposing your will on the world, often through artificial means or artifacts. The clearest example in The Hobbit is the ring.
Even though its full nature isn't revealed yet.
Right. We don't know it's the One Ring, but we see its effect on Gollum, how it twists his mind, makes him possessive, unnatural. And we see Bilbo using it for power, mainly invisibility, which helps him, but also separates him. Beyond the ring, you could argue the dwarves' intense desire for the gold, especially Thorin's dragon sickness, fits this theme too. It's a lust for control and wealth that becomes corrupting, a form of power that dominates his better judgment.
So the seeds of those major themes are already planted.
Definitely. And just one more point on structure, that episodic nature we talked about, moving from one distinct adventure to the next. The sources suggest that really helps the pacing and makes it highly entertaining, especially perhaps given its origins as a story told to children. It keeps things moving, always presenting a new challenge.
Right. So we've got the origins, the deep significance, the structure, the themes. Let's talk impact. What kind of ripple effect did The Hobbit have?
Oh, the impact was... It's hard to overstate it, really. It was absolutely foundational for modern fantasy literature. The sources basically say it laid the groundwork for the entire genre as we know it.
That's a huge statement. Laid the foundation.
It is, and it comes down to this simple point made in one source. Without the success of The Hobbit, you'd never have Lotharar nor the popular fantasy explosion that followed. Its success proved there was a mainstream audience hungry for this kind of imaginative storytelling. It opened the door.
It wasn't just that it sold well, though. It set a pattern.
Completely. It established so many of the tropes and conventions that became standard fantasy fare. Think about the character archetypes. You've got the reluctant hobbit hero, the wise wizard guide, the noble elves, the grumpy but stout dwarves, the greedy dragon. These became templates.
And the world building.
Huge influence there. Creating a detailed secondary world like Middle-earth with its own history, geography, languages, different races with distinct cultures. The Hobbit showed how compelling that could be. It set a standard for immersive world building.
Plus the quest narrative itself, the journey structure.
All became central elements. The Hobbit cracked open the market and provided the initial template. Then, of course, The Lord of the Rings built on that success and truly cemented modern fantasy, especially high or epic fantasy, with its massive scope, the deep history, the maps, the battles, the powerful artifact. But LTR stands on The Hobbit's shoulders.
which is why people call Tolkien the father of modern fantasy.
It's a well-earned title, largely thanks to these two works, and the influence spreads everywhere. You see it in major authors who followed Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books, are often cited as being directly inspired by Tolkien's approach to world-building and myth.
Even authors who seem to be reacting against Tolkien.
Yes, even them. Like George R.R. Martin with A Song of Ice and Fire, his work is often seen as a grittier, more cynical take on fantasy, deliberately subverting some Tolkien-esque ideals. But the very fact that it's often framed as a reaction shows how central Tolkien's work is. It's the benchmark everyone is responding to, whether building on it or tearing it down. His shadow looms large.
And the impact goes way beyond books.
Oh, absolutely. Role-playing games owe a massive debt. Dungeons & Dragons in its earliest forms drew heavily on Tolkien's races, elves, dwarves, hobbits, orcs, and the whole concept of an adventuring party exploring dangerous places for treasure. One source even humorously described the party in The Hobbit in D&D terms, like Gandalf being the high-level wizard, Thorin the fighter, Bilbo the rogue thief.
You can totally see it.
And from D&D, that influence flows directly into countless video games. The whole fantasy RPG genre is steeped in Tolkien's creations, directly or indirectly.
Plus the visual legacy, the fan culture.
Exactly. The illustrations by people like the Hildebrandt brothers, Alan Lee, John Howe, Ted Naismith, their visions of Middle-earth became iconic, shaping how people imagine the world and heavily influencing the look of later adaptations. And The Hobbit was one of those books that fostered intense fan communities long before the internet, laying groundwork for modern fandom. Its cultural footprint is just immense.
Okay, immense impact. But the story itself and how we experience it hasn't stayed frozen in time. We talked about the text changing.
Right. That big revision to the Gollum chapter being the prime example. Tolkien himself adapted his own story to fit the expanding mythology of The Lord of the Rings.
And then, much more recently, we got the film adaptations. Peter Jackson's trilogy, 2012 to 2014, which were, let's say, divisive.
That's a fair word for it. They were huge commercial successes, but definitely drew a lot of criticism, too. The sources frequently mentioned words like padding, bloated, even dull in places.
Why do you think the reaction was so mixed, or even negative in some quarters? The book is beloved.
Well, one huge factor mentioned consistently is the shadow of Jackson's own previous work, The Lord of the Rings film trilogy.
Right, those films were universally acclaimed, basically. Set an incredibly high bar.
An almost impossibly high bar. So the Hobbit films were inevitably going to be compared, and it was tough for them to measure up. Plus, Jackson made a conscious decision to try and link them stylistically.
Using the same music style, some of the same actors, that epic tone.
Exactly. Trying to make The Hobbit feel like a direct prequel trilogy to LOTR in terms of scale and seriousness. But the argument from critics was that this fundamentally clashed with the book's tone.
Which is, as we said, generally lighter, more episodic, more like a fairy tale in parts.
Precisely. To make The Hobbit fit that LOTR mold and to stretch one relatively short book into 3 long movies, they had to add a lot of material pulling bits from the LOTR appendices, inventing new subplots like the Tauriel-Kili romance, expanding battles, and that's where the feeling of padding and bloat came from for many viewers. It lost some of the charm and tightness of the original story in the attempt to replicate the epic feel of LOTR.
Although it's worth noting, some research suggests the films might have had a different impact on younger viewers.
Yes, there was that interesting study mentioned. It found that older teenagers seem to have a more nuanced reaction, perhaps not just dismissing the films outright. And it found some evidence, particularly among younger teens, like 13-year-olds, that seeing the films actually increased their intention to read the book.
So for some, the films could have acted as a gateway to the book, not just a replacement.
Potentially, yeah. Which is a positive outcome, even amidst the criticisms. It shows how adaptations can work in complex ways.
And this whole discussion about adaptations ties into that broader idea of Middle-earth fatigue that sometimes comes up now.
Right, the suggestion that maybe audiences are getting tired of Middle-earth stories, especially with newer things like the Rings of Power series facing scrutiny. But one source made a good point. Maybe it's not fatigue with Middle-earth itself, but fatigue with familiar stories or familiar approaches.
People want something new, but still authentic.
Possibly. The argument is that adaptations need to find a way to feel fresh and evolve while still capturing the essence of Tolkien's world. And maybe the Hobbit films suffered a bit because they leaned too hard on replicating the known formula of the LOTR films, instead of finding a cinematic language that better suited the unique spirit of the Hobbit book itself. It's a tricky balancing act for anyone adapting beloved material.
Okay, so we've journeyed all the way from the origins, through the deep significance, the huge impact, the evolution and adaptations. Let's try to synthesize this. What's the practical relevance? What can we actually take away and use from this deep dive into The Hobbit?
Well, pulling together all those different ways of looking at it, the adventure story, the coming-of-age tale, the leadership allegory, the hero's journey, it gives us a really rounded picture of the wisdom embedded in it.
And maybe the most obvious takeaway is about courage, right? Especially Bilbo's courage.
Absolutely. His transformation from this fussy, comfort-loving hobbit into someone capable of facing down spiders and dragons. It's a powerful message that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about acting despite fear. And that bravery can come from the most unexpected, seemingly ordinary people. You don't have to be a warrior king to be heroic.
It also really champions the idea of stepping outside your comfort zone, doesn't it?
Hugely. Bilbo's whole adventure is forced on him, but it's only by leaving the Shire that he discovers what he's capable of. It suggests that real growth, real adventure, the things that truly change us, often lie beyond the familiar and the comfortable.
And there's that recurring theme about inner qualities versus external power.
Yes, linking back to that machine idea, Bilbo's strengths are his wit, his loyalty, his moral compass, his resilience. These internal qualities ultimately prove more valuable and less corrupting than Thorin's focus on reclaiming external power and wealth. It suggests true strength is built from within, not imposed from without.
You know, the process we just went through, looking at the story from all these different angles, literary, allegorical, mythic, that itself feels like a lesson.
That's a great point. It shows the value of perspective. Any complex thing, whether it's a story or a real-world issue, reveals more when you examine it through multiple lenses. You get a richer, deeper understanding.
And one of the sources mentioned this lovely idea that stories like The Hobbit sustain us by connecting us to the good, the true, and the beautiful. What does that mean in practice?
I think it means that engaging with narratives that explore themes of courage, friendship, hope versus despair, and that create worlds filled with wonder and beauty, actually nourishes something fundamental in us. It gives us a sense of meaning, maybe offers archetypes or ideals that help us navigate our own, often messy, reality. It feeds the soul, in a way.
But ultimately, knowledge isn't much use unless you apply it. So how do we take these lessons from Bilbo and apply them?
Well, we can ask ourselves, right, what are our own metaphorical dragons? What fears or challenges are we avoiding? What shire, what comfortable routine might we need to step beyond to find our own hidden strengths? Do we have a tookish side, a potential for courage or creativity that we haven't explored because we haven't pushed ourselves?
It's about seeing Bilbo's journey not just as a fantasy story, but as a map for personal growth.
Exactly. And that underlying message, identified in the sources having the courage to step beyond the familiar, trusting that adventure lies outside the comfort of home. That's why these Middle-earth stories continue to resonate so deeply, regardless of how adaptations fare. It's a timeless, universal call.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into The Hobbit, maybe final thought for you, the listener, to take away is this. What familiar path in your own life might require a bit more courage to step beyond? And how might you find and embrace your own inner tookish side?
Definitely something worth reflecting on.
Thanks for listening to All in All.